PGCE Research Bites, from the team behind Emma and Tom Talk Teaching. Hello and welcome to PGCE Research Bites, a showcase for the very best student-teacher research from the Cardiff Partnership for Initial Teacher Education. My guest for this episode is Matthew Green, who's one of my very own PGCE secondary music students. Hi Matthew.
Hello Tom.
So you've just completed a research project, a literature-based research project for your lead partnership school. Now, we can't name that school because of the terms under which we received ethical approval for the research project from the university, but it's a school in Cardiff in South Wales, and this school picked the topic because it's of interest to them at the moment. So what was the topic they gave you?
The school sort of gave a broad topic of, quite simply, an aspect of pedagogy in relation to blended learning, and they really helpfully provided some aspects and some short reads and some long reads and a couple of videos on different things like making it stick, literacy in the classroom, and maybe 5 or 6 other topics. And helpfully as well, they gave us an insight into what individual departments were looking at throughout the year. And the music department, as a music specialist, I was particularly interested in, and they were looking at feedback. So out of this emerged this topic of feedback, which would be my pedagogical aspect or part of the pedagogy, feedback in relation to blended learning.
So a particularly interesting kind of area to look at there. And you had 6 sources that you were allowed to draw in to look at in detail to kind of inform your conclusions on that. So what were the 6 sources you ended up with, and kind of broadly, what did each one of them have to bring to the party?
It's probably worth mentioning that all those 6 sources would form a critically annotated bibliography. So when researching and when approaching this assignment, I wasn't setting out to answer the question or offer any authoritative conclusion about feedback in relation to blended learning. My aim was to present 6 texts or 6 pieces of research that I felt were worthy contributors to a critical debate or developing understanding of this subject. So that meant I was kind of free to select a variety of sources and build a picture, rather than saying, okay, like by the end of this, you'll know everything there is to know, and we'll be in a perfect position to nail feedback in relation to blended learning. Instead, it was more about finding the sources that would maybe push forward understanding in the school, certainly push forward my understanding. And the other thing to say was that, I was pretty realistic about the context. Why did the music department want to know about blended learning? Well, because they're having to do a lot more of it now than ever before. Why did they want to know about feedback? Well, probably because they've been giving feedback for years and years, and they'll be doing so for many years to come. So in that sense, actually, the feedback side of things, the pedagogy side of things, was maybe, for me, a little bit more valuable, especially as I began to research blended learning. Everything indicated that whatever technology, whatever domain you're working in, your pedagogy has to be sound. So from that perspective, it was really important that I nailed the feedback side of things. So one other thing, just to give the last bit of context, the school that I was doing this research for, or with, I suppose, it's pretty clear that they place well-being really high up on the agenda, well-being alongside achievement. And I felt that was a really important sort of like guiding principle, not that it would define my research, but it would be a consideration. Because sometimes you could come up with the most magnificent piece of research that tells you something really radical. But if that was going to make things really tough for students and potentially affect their well-being, it wasn't likely to benefit my research or my critically annotated bibliography.
That's a really clear kind of roundup of the context there. And I really like that kind of pragmatism about, we're never going to nail this kind of in finality, but here's a contribution. And also that well-being aspect, particularly in the time of COVID, is really important. So it's great to kind of set your stall out before you start with something like this. So what did you end up with choosing to kind of inform your contribution to this?
Yeah, so I started by looking at some key texts about feedback and going down the rabbit hole of who people had referenced and who people had cited on various bits and pieces that I'd read, I came across a really important piece of work by Hattie and Timperley. It's an article called "The Power of Feedback," and it's a meta-analysis of loads of different research undertaken by previous researchers. And because it's a meta-analysis, it felt to me quite reliable and quite comprehensive, and it's been cited by a lot of other people. So I thought, well, this is trustworthy. I could have dug a little bit deeper into the original research that they'd kind of consolidated, but that felt to me like one layer too deep. That would be like going slightly too deep in the inception sort of structure of things. But anyway, the kind of key points that were drawn out from that research were that effective feedback answers 3 questions. And those 3 questions were, where am I going? How am I going? And where to next? It was really interesting that those are all sort of pushing forward. Those are all feedback. It's not about where you are now. It's about where you're going to get to. How are you going to develop your learning? And the way Hattie and Timperley structured this is that feedback can be sort of targeted at 4 areas, and that is the sort of task level or task area and how well tasks are understood or performed by learners, the process level, which feeds back on the main processes needed to understand or perform a task, the self-regulation level, which is kind of your individual perception, your choices around what you do at a task, and then self level, personal evaluations and effect, usually positive about the learner. I'm reading those out. I haven't just memorized them, but I feel like they're definitely worth like repeating there. Really interesting one is this self level, because that would be your kind of, oh, well done, Matthew, you did an assignment and you finished it on time. And maybe it's quite easy to give feedback of that nature, but the other ones, certainly, like for me as a novice teacher developing my ability and giving feedback, they've provided a lot of food for thought. But this meta-analysis, as I mentioned, from Hattie and Timperley, 2007, so I tried to get everything from the last 10 years, but this was just outside of that, but I felt it was justifiable given that it was so research informed and so heavily cited.
Yeah, it's hard to do feedback without doing Hattie, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I was looking for a few headliners, a few big names at the Feedback Festival, and those guys came up. So the next source that I selected was by Wiliam, and he's an expert in assessment for learning, but I think assessment for learning and feedback is sort of left hand to right hand. So this article is really short. It's maybe like 7 or 8 pages, and I imagined that maybe teachers, if they ever get lunch breaks anymore, could read this in the staff room. It'd be really easy. It's called "The Secret of Effective Feedback," and that title was really enticing because we'd all want to know the secret. And rather than looking at the qualities of feedback like Hattie and Timperley had, Wiliam was more talking about the value of feedback and how to get the most out of it. What's the point of feedback if students don't use it, and how can we as teachers make feedback appealing to them? So it felt like a really practical, really pragmatic source. Wiliam was saying, kind of don't overcomplicate it, make it relevant, make it accessible. And I really like the point he makes about using relationships. He talks very much that if a student doesn't know you and doesn't trust you, they won't trust your feedback. They won't act on your feedback because they won't believe what you have to say, and they won't believe what you have to say is going to help them get better. And I felt like all of that really tied in with that kind of well-being context as well, because in blended learning, relationships are really important. In a stressful time, in COVID-19, in a pandemic, if you've got a good relationship with a student, you can say, look, I'm going to give you some feedback. I'm addressing these areas that you've worked really hard on, but you're not quite there yet, and this is what you need to do in order to get there. That has got so much more meaning than saying, well, I don't know who you are, but that performance was all right, but here's what to do to improve. Just from a student's perspective, that would change things. And it sounds so logical and it sounds so simple talking about it now, but actually there's not always that clarity in research sometimes. So it was really great to have Wiliam just a voice in the ear that was very simple and obvious to understand.
Two reassuringly big names so far then, Hattie and Wiliam. I like that human side to the feedback as well. It's easy for it to turn into a very kind of dry thing to think about. So I found that a really refreshing angle.
Yeah, absolutely. So after I'd kind of set my stall out a little bit with regards to what is quality feedback and what is valuable feedback, now I needed to express a bit more about what blended learning kind of is, what it can mean, and kind of how we're doing it. And I did a lot of reading and research into this that didn't make it into the assignment, but because it kind of wasn't necessary. It maybe some of it didn't have anything to do with feedback, and I really wanted my sources to have something to do with feedback. But a couple of key points. Definition of blended learning, I tried to leave this really open, and I found a great one from Senedd Learning or Senedd Research blog, which has a Welsh connection as well. And it basically said blended learning typically means combining face-to-face learning in school with learning from home, usually using digital tools. I thought, well, that's perfect. Every single school, no matter how differently they're doing it, they're probably doing something along those lines. And then secondly, again, context specific, the blended learning that has been experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic isn't the kind of blended learning that's been researched. The kind of blended learning that's been the core of research has been maybe university-based and quite controlled studies with a very specifically designed program of learning, and possibly even with some control elements to it. Whereas in reality, the kind of blended learning that we've been doing in schools is more like emergency remote teaching or reactive teaching in response to the social need, in response to the pandemic. So like that wasn't something that always came through in the literature, but it was a really important context to me, because there's no point me saying, okay, it takes 6 weeks to design a perfect blended learning program that integrates these aspects of feedback, because that's not the world that we're living in. We're trying to do this a bit more on the day-to-day. I don't want to say on the fly, because I really do think teachers have thought about this and done their research, but back at the start of the pandemic, that wasn't necessarily the case. Interestingly, this really tied in well with Daisy Christodoulou's latest book, Teachers versus Tech. And Christodoulou's whole book really was about advocating for the use of technology. So it's quite timely, but already a bit dated, because she's advocating for something that we've kind of already grabbed hold of. But the essence of her two key points that I sort of drew out was that we should be using technology that is actually proven to be useful, not things that are just faddy, full of bells and whistles, but things that are really going to influence and improve outcomes for learners and possibly for teachers as well. Like, if you can save time, great, save time. But if you save time at the expense of learning, that's not so ideal, is it? And then the second thing was actually about online quizzes and sort of adaptive learning programs. This was really interesting because I knew that quizzes were being used a lot in school, and I wanted to know, what are they actually good for? What are they not so good for? And can you give meaning feedback from an online quiz? So Christodoulou basically claims that adaptive quizzes are going to be really, really helpful over the next few years, as you could build up. But basically, a student has a quiz, they answer some questions. Depending on the answers, they get presented with different questions and different learning plans. Teachers get a whole wealth of data about common misconceptions about who's doing well and who's not, where they're falling down, and so on and so forth. And it's really promising. But I actually looked into some of the research behind this, and I found that the research highlighted a few issues maybe with adaptive quizzes or online quizzes that are probably quite logical to us. They're quite limited in what they can test, and so basically they're brilliant for low stakes recall, but kind of it seems to me that there's diminishing returns after that. If you're doing anything that requires any kind of critical analysis or critical thinking, they probably won't help you. And in music, we don't do we haven't historically, at least, done a ton of low stakes recall. It's not always been a feature of music teaching. However, over the last 6-9 months, it's probably featured a lot more.
Yeah, this whole knowledge-based kind of movement, I suppose you hear a lot about knowledge-based curriculums and things, and I always think the same as you, it tends to fall down in certain subject areas, which I wonder whether they've fully remembered when they're pushing some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. But nevertheless, I found this to be a really great resource, and it got me to thinking. Okay, I could do some quizzes, I could do some adaptive quizzes, and I could integrate some feedback into those. And I'll talk about this later about video-based feedback. But basically, I tried to give some additional feedback on these quizzes using videos that I made that gave explanations of musical examples. And I immediately ran into a bit of a sticking point in that very few people access those videos. I could see they were hosted on YouTube, and I could see the number of views that they were getting was really low. So that was a really interesting experience for me. Okay, I've read these things in the research, and there was a key point from Wiliam that I maybe didn't pay enough attention to, which is you've got to have a relationship with the students, and you've got to maybe actually direct their attention to the feedback and how it might be valuable to them. So it was all very well me saying, okay, answer this question, tell me whether this music is using swing rhythms or straight rhythms. They answer the question, maybe they get it wrong, and then because they've got it wrong, they automatically get a video which is me explaining why it's swing rhythms. Well, they're not going to watch it. They're not interested, they're not bothered. I haven't established that relationship with them, haven't told them the feedback's there. It's not going to be useful feedback to them at that point. And that was really interesting to me, sort of combining some of the research there. Quite a good learning experience for me. So I'll talk now about the fourth source that I had. This was by Clark and Mayer. It's a chapter in a book, and the book is called E-Learning and the Science of Instruction, Proven Guidelines for Consumers and Designers of Multimedia Learning. That's a real mouthful.
Sounds promising.
Well, yeah. And I picked this up from a reference or citation somewhere, and I thought, well, I'll have a look at it. They've got a chapter in there about feedback and assessment. And I started reading it, and the first page is quite dense, and it's really aimed at, I don't know, people who build online platforms for high-end corporate businesses where maybe so-and-so needs to learn about how to use this really dry system at work, and they've got an IT guy who's going to build a program, probably on Flash or Adobe or whatever it is, to make that work for them. And as I was going through this, I sort of got past that bit, but all of a sudden there started to be really obvious but sensible and research-backed gems, absolutely fantastic things that make so much sense. For example, place feedback so learners can see their question, the response, and the feedback in one place. Well, yeah, that makes so much sense. That's probably what we would do, with an exam paper. Why don't we do that online? And then for multi-step problems, provide step-by-step feedback. Well, yeah, that ties in with Hattie and Timperley. That ties in with Wiliam. For questions with multiple answers, show the correct answer next to the learner's answer and include explanations for all correct answers. Brilliant. So basically, this unexpected source, really high tech, maybe, kind of came to fruition. And I realized that actually teachers now, we're not just classroom teachers, we are designers of e-learning environments. We are making decisions about what software, what systems to use. So these principles apply as much to us as they do to anyone else. A couple of other points that came from Clark and Mayer that I really thought was quite interesting. Firstly, which is the matching of feedback to the task. If you've got a complex task, audio feedback is probably going to be better and more comprehensive than written feedback. You get so much more through, the inflections in someone's voice, tone of voice, and that can really help a learner to understand what the feedback is and where it's going. And I thought about how can that be relevant in music? Well, you could literally give audio feedback to a recorded performance. So someone gives a performance, usually you would write down some notes and hand them a piece of paper, and it says, at this bit you did that, and at this bit you did that, and now you need to improve. But if you record that performance, and then you play that performance back and you speak over the top of it, maybe pausing it here or there where you're giving specific feedback. For example, as you're getting to the verse, you can say, can pause it and you say, okay, when you get to the verse, you go a little bit too loud, and then that student can hear everything, and it's placed so appropriately, and they would get the tone of voice, so they'd understand that it's not kind of a big deal. They'd build some trust with you. It just felt to me really valuable. And the second thing that Clark and Mayer talk about ties in with some other sources as well is peer feedback. Difficult to do online, but not impossible. You need to get the tech sorted. You need to build the skills in learners as well. But what, as a novice teacher, I hadn't necessarily appreciated that peer feedback actually doesn't benefit the person receiving the feedback as much as it benefits the person giving the feedback. When you give feedback, you have to think about so many things. So peer feedback, that act of telling someone else what they could do to improve, whether they act on it or not, actually is irrelevant to you. The act of you working out what someone else needs to do to improve will help you as an individual. So I thought that was just brilliant. And this I don't have favourites in my sources, but I'm really particularly keen on this one, and I think it's going to be quite influential it was quite influential in sort of a swing point in the assignment for me.
Really practical and pragmatic, all that stuff, isn't it? And we need a bit of that in our lives.
Yeah, for sure. So the last two sources that I put forward were specific about music, subject specific. All through the other sources, I was able to draw out something musical from them. But I wanted to talk or put forward sources that were by musicians about music and how feedback is used. And I went right back to basics, and I went to Philpott and Evans. It's a chapter called Assessment in Music Education. And it's in the book Learning to Teach Music in the Secondary School. And I figured that, a lot of early career teachers maybe would be familiar with this. Maybe there's previous editions of this book that more senior teachers might know. So it would be like a common text to us all. Philpott and Evans, they talk about feedback in music should be focused on musical skills and knowledge and relate to specific and clear criteria. But there's other literature from the sort of music canon or of research by Swanwick, which I was reading at the time, and it threw up a big question mark. It's like, okay, well, you're telling me feedback in music should focus on musical skills and knowledge, but your musical skills and knowledge and that you value will be different to what I value as a musician. So that immediately threw up a challenge to me, in that different value judgments in music are going to undermine feedback efficiency. There is a subjective and a values-based element to music, and we need to recognize that. And that kind of links into the second part of Philpott and Evans's points, which was that sometimes in music it's perfectly appropriate, and maybe it's best to just leave well alone. If someone's been and given a really expressive performance about something that's deeply personal to them, you need to exercise your professional judgment. You need to prioritize well-being over achievement. You need to be cautious of giving feedback on the self level, and maybe just saying thank you very much. You've done an excellent job there would be enough, and that can be the feedback. You don't always have to be a perfectionist, because your idea of perfect and the values that you place on it might conflict with someone else's, and that could be damaging. So it's a bit of a warning, but really, really useful one all the same. And then moving on to the final source now. This was by Hatch. It's called Going Beyond It Sounds Good, Developing Student Capacity to Give Meaningful Feedback. And it's quite a short article, and it draws sort of qualitatively and anecdotally from the author's teaching practice. They've researched and they've used lots of different peer feedback tools in their own classroom practice. And it was an excellent source in terms of, I kind of imagine myself, well, in a couple of years, if I've done a bit more research, then I could talk about how I've used that in a classroom, and teachers at the school that I was doing this research for, they could really connect to it as well. So a couple of key points in this source were that, again, like Philpott and Evans, that performance and composition can be really personal. So there's vulnerability involved in giving and receiving feedback, remembering that this source is more based on peer feedback, student capacity to give peer feedback. And so because of that vulnerability, you've got to create a learning environment that's a safe space where mistakes are embraced and the feedback that you give and received is done in a sensitive way. Hatch really acknowledged that giving feedback is hard, and I really was sympathetic to this point after having researched feedback and at certain points, confused myself and really had to unpick what quality and valuable feedback meant. I was thinking, it's not easy at all. So how do we expect students to do that really well? How do we expect students who aren't professional feedback givers to give good quality feedback? Well, Hatch talks about using scaffolding, talks about modeling, talks about providing lists of terminology that could be used, talks about even conversation frames and processes that you could use in a classroom. And I thought that would be like really interesting to do, especially I'm quite a big fan of, in some regards, like protocol-based approaches to things and having routines. And that actually came out in some of the research about blended learning. For example, Kai and Wang and Doug Lemov, they talked about having a protocol-based approach to your classroom. You come in, you take your chairs out, you stand by your chairs, you do your start or whatever, doing the same online and doing the same through peer feedback as well. And the final thing that Hatch brought out is that music making is not a checklist. So you need to leave some space. You need to leave room for those value judgments. It would be perfectly possible to provide a rubric, meet all the aspects of that rubric. A student doing peer feedback could say, yeah, you've ticked all these boxes, but you need to provide some space for interpretation and creativity. And it's really valuable to provide feedback outside of a rubric or a checklist sometimes. I think that also, again, ties in with aspects of Hattie and Timperley, certainly ties in with Dylan and Wiliam about this trust and relationship. Those last two sources don't talk so much about blended learning, but then it's up to us as the teachers, understanding these pedagogical aspects, understanding the research, to do our due diligence, like Daisy Christodoulou says, and say, well, these are the things that are going to make quality feedback. Is this technology or is this software going to enable that? Is it going to lead to that? Is me giving a lecture on Teams or Google Class, Google Meet, going to enable me to give feedback about these things? So everything comes back into a kind of ecosystem, I suppose.
Well, one of the things I really, really enjoyed about this assignment, amongst many things, was the way you managed in just 6 sources to really kind of, you really made them count. We've got the reassuringly big names of feedback and assessment for learning, Hattie, Wiliam. We've got the reassuringly big names of music education there. Philpott, Swanwick is mentioned, Evans. And we've got, the really pragmatic, how do you build it source? And we've got Daisy Christodoulou, who's very up to the minute, big name, well known in kind of teaching circles. And, you managed to kind of take that really widely chosen set of sources and keep your focus on the subject of music and focus that down into some really, really clear conclusions. And we asked you to produce a visual kind of version of that and present it to your lead schools. So how did that go and what did you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, making the infographic was really interesting, actually, because I was able to strip out a lot of the, don't be offended, but the academic stuff and just present that, rather than saying, oh, this source is good because it's really critical of these things. I left out anything negative. The school doesn't want to know that. The school just wants to know what are the key points, what are the positive impacts that this research can have on our practice and hopefully for us, benefit things for our students. So I just told them, Hattie and Timperley, it says this, it says do this, it says do that, it says this is a positive thing. So I presented, it's a really nice looking table with colour and icons that someone could put up on the wall of a staff room or a music office somewhere and just have a quick look at to remind themselves. And so presenting that was really straightforward to do in some respects. Once the work is done, once the graphic is done, it speaks for itself, and we were able to have a discussion about feedback, about what was good about the research, and also just articulate some next steps as well. at the bottom of the infographic, I kind of had these three areas. What type of feedback could I use? So, for example, complex tasks, consider audio feedback. Performances, consider narrated video feedback. Recall, consider automated feedback from online quizzes. And very personal, expressive performances, consider just leave well alone. That's one box. And then had some key points that if you only had 10 seconds to look at the infographic, at least you'd get something out of it. And then I wanted to, like, you don't want to overstep the mark. I don't work at this school. I'm not telling them what to do with their lives, but I felt it was important to articulate what they could do next. So just 3 simple steps that came out of this for me. And so these are 3 simple steps of what I would do. Add a where to next sentence stem or thinking frame to feedback policy and practice for both teacher and peer feedback. So that's one, your where to next. Number 2, we talked a lot about well-being and feedback. Well, research it. Research student perception of feedback. Get to know how you can influence student perception of feedback. Maybe do some action research and student forums. And then the third thing, also connected to that, was monitor the impact of feedback, but not just on student achievement, but also monitor the impact of feedback on student well-being, coming out of the context of what we've discussed. So in terms of the visual summary, I quite enjoyed doing it. Took a bit of time to get it to look how I wanted it to look, but the content was all done through the assignment. But it made you think, okay, what points have I actually made here? What's the essence of it? If someone said to me, you've done some research, it's your elevator pitch, basically, isn't it? You've got 30 seconds, tell me what I should do. Well, these are the things you should do, and that's the research that proves it or that suggests that you should do it. That was what the infographic was.
So the school got a huge amount to take away from the assignment. But I suppose my final question is for you personally. I mean, the assignment was hopefully for you personally as well. I mean, where next for you as a teacher and where next for you as a researcher?
Good question. Where next for me as a teacher? Clinical practice too, and hopefully more time physically in school. But also, using these sources, using the research that I found, thinking quite consciously and quite conscientiously about the feedback that I give, how I give the feedback. I've already tried out a couple of the things, as I mentioned earlier. I tried those explanation videos, and they went not perfectly, but learning from that. And then as a researcher, yes, certainly like student perception of feedback. I think if I was continue the sort of the feedback theme, but also from this kind of research, a lot of thoughts emerged about, well, because not all of it is talking about music in terms of performance and composition and really those sort of uniquely musical aspects. It got me thinking a lot about what does music do well in blended learning? Why have we had to change the way we're teaching a little bit? What aspects of that can we carry on? What are we going to bin off immediately and get straight back to making loud music in classrooms, which is just the best? And I came to the conclusion that actually it's sort of the literacy side of things and the historic and the academic side of things of music has got a lot of untapped potential that was foregrounded and highlighted through blended learning. Maybe there's more to do with that. Maybe looking at where the literacy and numeracy framework can kind of come into its own through music will be a bit of interest to me. So I think that's probably the next phase for me.
Well, thanks, Matthew. That's been a really, really interesting rundown of a great piece of research that you've done. I'll make sure that all the references to your 6 sources are in the notes for this episode in case anyone wants to go and have a read of them for themselves. But thanks for your generosity and giving your time today. It's been really interesting.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for asking me to talk.
PGCE Research Bites comes from the team behind Emma and Tom Talk Teaching and is presented this week by me, Tom Breeze. It showcases the best student-teacher research from the Cardiff Partnership for Initial Teacher Education. Thanks to Matthew Green from PGCE Secondary Music, who joined us today to share his research. Podcast artwork is by Beth Blandford and the music is by Cameron Stewart. We'll be back with a regular episode next week, and PGCE Research Bites will be back in a fortnight.